It all began with one of those awkward handshakes. You know, the ones we've had over the last 2 years. One person forms a fist and hits the open hand, and the other person switches back and forth. That's basically what happened when Alireza Firouzja and Daniil Dubov met at the World Blitz Chess Championship. The handshake was awkward. The game was compelling. Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery, and we're going to dive right in. These two superstars of chess, Alireza Firouzja and Daniil Dubov. Dubov has white, Firouzja has black. Let's jump right in. Dubov, as you can see, started the game with d4. Firouzja plays knight f6, knight f3, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2. Dubov is very comfortable with the kingside Fianchetto of his bishop. He plays the Catalan a lot as well. Both sides castle, and now Firouzja has to make a decision. He can either play d6, which is a King's Indian, or play d5, which would be a Grunfeld. And he thinks about it for a second during the game, and then decides to go ahead with d6, play the King's Indian move order, which is definitely a more dynamic option in this particular structure. Dubov plays a4. This is a very positional approach. The idea is that a pawn is going to squeeze black, gain some space on the queen side. Very positional idea, though. We'll see how well it works. Firouzja plays knight b to d7, a5, continuing to gain that space, c6, b3. The idea is he can play the bishop at c1 to b2 and maybe challenge the bishop at g7. Or if black plays e5, then the d6 square becomes vulnerable and the bishop can go to a3. So that's the idea. The downside of it, of course, is that Dubov is weakening his own dark squares. e5, and this is already a novelty at move 8. That's very early for players of this level. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and there can be no doubt that this d6 square is the weakest point in black's position, and Dubov immediately wants to exploit that. He plays knight f to d2. The idea is the knight can go to c4 and hit that d6 square. Now, if you look at Dubov's basic approach, and I don't know if he did this for psychological reasons or not, but we've seen before this approach to Alireza Firouzja's game, this idea that you're going to play positionally, try to limit the tactics, sort of squeeze and limit all of Alireza Firouzja's counterplay. But the problem is that's like sitting on a barrel full of TNT, hoping it doesn't explode. And with Firouzja, it usually does. If you let him in, if you give him just a little room, he's going to come in with a bulldozer. And that's the danger of playing like this. Firouzja plays e4. That gains space, blocks the bishop at g2. It can't be taken because that would unleash the bishop at g7. We'll be able to take the rook at a1 in that instance. Knight to c4, continuing the plan. Now, knight to d5. And this unleashes the bishop at g7. It's aiming right at the rook at a1, threatening to capture it. Dubov has to do something about it. He could play bishop to b2, but in that case, bishop takes, knight takes, queen to f6, and there's a pin along this diagonal. He's attacking the knight at b2, and it's pinned to the rook at a1. Rook to a2 to escape the pin, then rook to d8 is a strong move. Queen to c1 would be the best move, but white's very passive here. And if he plays a move like, say, bishop to e4, he's just lost because of this sequence of moves. Knight to b4, hitting the rook and threatening the knight if the rook moves. And after rook to a4, counterattacking, then knight to c5. The knight hits the rook and the bishop. The rook hits the queen, and the game would be over. So instead of playing bishop to b2, he plays the rook to a4. Knight to c5. Now you already see, we talked about that little, giving Firouzja that little opening. It looks like he's beginning to go through it. Knight to c5, hits the rook at a4. Black is really active now, and at move 12 is already better. Firouzja has the better position than Dubov. He plays rook to a2. Firouzja plays knight to b4, hitting the rook again. And Dubov decides to go ahead and give up the exchange for a knight and a pawn. If he tried to, let's say if he tried to keep the exchange, say with rook to a3, then simply queen takes, knight c2. Black is winning. He's up a pawn, has a much better position. So really giving away the exchange is the best option for white at this point. He does so with bishop to a3, queen takes, rook takes, knight takes the rook, and then bishop takes c5. The rook goes to e8, then bishop takes e4. So he gets a pawn back, and obviously I didn't even look at this, but rook takes bishop, rook to d8 check, and this bishop would come here, and then obviously. So the pawn cannot be taken on e4. Firouzja plays bishop to h3, taking away breathing space for the king. Dubov immediately plays the bishop back to g2 to challenge that bishop. And at this point, Alireza he picks up, he almost touches, he doesn't touch Dubov's g2 bishop in order to exchange it. But then he pulls back and changes his mind and notices that this e2 pawn is the weakest, probably the weakest spot in White's position. So he goes ahead and plays bishop to g4, aiming at that weakness. Dubov plays a6. He wants to soften up this long diagonal. Now, Dubov is already in quite a bit of trouble, of course, being down the exchange. Computers prefer f3, bishop e6, knight to d6, hopping in, hitting the rook and the pawn, but black is still better. He can fend off these threats. So Dubov plays a6 to soften up the long diagonal for his g2 bishop. b6, this pawn at b6 counterattacks the bishop at c5. So if Dubov had just taken here at c6, after pawn takes bishop, takes, the two bishops are very, very valuable here, and black is completely winning in this position, just up an entire minor piece. So Dubov just retreats that bishop to e3, and then bishop takes e2. The bishop moved to g4 has borne fruit, and Firouzja has picked up the e2 pawn. Rook to d2 counterattacks that bishop, but then bishop takes knight at c4. Firouzja is giving up the bishop pair, but in return is wrecking Dubov's pawn structure. c2, c4, and a6 are all weak pawns, although the pawn at a6 could become dangerous later because it's so far advanced. So black plays rook a to c8, c3, knight takes c3, knight takes c3, bishop takes c3. And now White is just hoping that he can generate enough counterplay against this a7 pawn to take advantage of the fact that he's down an exchange and a pawn, but that's asking a bit much. Rook to d7. Now rook c to d8, challenging the rook. He has to give up the a7 pawn, otherwise the bishop would take on c6. Like, he can't do this, and then the bishop takes here. But what he does, he understands a very basic principle of chess that we should all know. Every Russian schoolboy knows, as they says, and that's that rooks belong behind passed pawns. So Dubov takes the a7 pawn, but then rook to d1 check, forcing bishop to f1, then rook to a1, and the rook is behind the pawn. Dubov plays king to g2 to get out of the pin of the rook, then c5 to block this e3 bishop from taking the b6 pawn. Bishop to d3, rook to a2. Now he's actually threatening rook takes bishop because there's a pin on this f2 pawn. Dubov plays king to f3, stepping out of the pin. Bishop to d4 to get pieces off the board. And if White exchanges, which he does, black gets a passed d-pawn. White plays bishop to e4. What this does, it aims at this potential queening square for the a6 pawn, but also the bishop can settle on d5 and aim at f7. Rook to a3 check, king to f4, and then Firouzja pushes his pawn to d3, only 2 squares away from queening. The bishop goes to d5. If he plays something like rook to d7 to stop the pawn, which is passive, black just takes the a6 pawn. All of White's counterplay is gone, and black has a simple endgame win. So in an attempt to complicate matters, Dubov plays bishop to d5, aiming at the f7 pawn, d2, one square away from queening, bishop takes f7 check, king to f8, and now if he just takes the rook, obviously black would queen, so that doesn't work. So he pulls the bishop back with the idea, hoping that after rook to f7 check, king to g8 with some sort of discovery, he might be able to pull a trick. And Firouzja really considers this move, rook to e7. He debates it for a bit. He almost touches the rook, then changes his mind, realizing he can go ahead and queen, and these threats are not going to be able to win or fight for White. D1 promotes to a queen, rook to f7, check, king g8, rook to e7, discovered check, but then watch this neat and clean finish for Alireza. He gives the queen back by taking the bishop, that's delivering check, rook to e8, check, which is an intermezzo, but then king to f7, and here Dubov resigns because of this sequence of moves. After white takes the queen, he would just take the rook at e8 and be up an entire rook in the endgame, and it would be over. An interesting game from two powerhouse players at the Blitz World Championship. I hope you enjoyed it. Join us again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.